All right, a quick review on the Constitutional Convention and federalism, a supplemental lecture. Okay, so remember, federalism is the idea that power is shared between the federal and national government and the states. If you have to look back at that video on the Articles of Confederation for a good explanation, do so. All right. So now, when we look at the Constitutional Convention, I wanted to keep a couple of big questions in mind. What were the compromises made? Remember that central to these is the idea of representation, and what were the differences between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and how they viewed the Constitution and the idea of federalism. Okay, and 3, why a Bill of Rights? You must know a bunch of the Bill of Rights. Okay, all right. So, what is the Constitutional Convention? Simply a meeting of delegates that occurred in Philadelphia in 1787. Its original intent was to rewrite or amend the Articles of Confederation, but the delegates ended up throwing them out altogether and starting over. At the convention, each state had 1 vote, and 3/4 or 9 were needed for ratification or approval of the new Constitution. One of the first things they addressed was the need for more federal power. Remember the differences in the 2 charts describing federalism? So the federal government's delegated or enumerated powers are much stronger than under the Articles, and those reserved for the states were much weaker. Remember, those shared are called concurrent. Now, when the delegates arrived, Madison from Virginia, who we call the father of the Constitution, the little man with the big brain, came with a plan, the Virginia Plan, or the Large State Plan, which called for a bicameral 2-house legislature with representation based on population. Naturally, this didn't go over well with the states with smaller populations, who feared they would permanently be under the tyranny of the larger states. So Patterson from New Jersey came back with the New Jersey Plan, or the Small State Plan, that called for a unicameral legislature with equal representation. Sounds too much like the Articles. Now, what comes about when we have 2 opposing ideas? Nobody gets all of what they want. Somebody has to come up with a compromise. Our first and very important one comes from Roger Sherman from Connecticut, the Connecticut Plan, or the Great Compromise. Okay, the Great Compromise creates a bicameral legislature, 2 houses, consistent with Senate, where we have equal representation, 2 per state, elected for 6 years, with indirect election at first, picked by state legislatures until the 17th Amendment. These guys were supposed to be a bit aristocratic, well-educated, not common. The other house is the House of Representatives, where representation is based on population, as figured by the constitutionally directed census, remember, every 10 years. They are directly elected by the people for 2-year terms, and these guys are closer to the people and represent the people and are much more accountable to the people, where the Senate really represents the concerns of the states, not the people. All right, some key powers of the House: all revenue bills start in the House, and they possess the power to impeach or bring charges against the president. All right, the next big compromise, and remember, when we are forced to compromise, everyone comes away feeling unsatisfied. Nobody gets what they want. All right, is the 3/5ths Compromise. The 3/5ths Compromise has to do with the House of Reps and the number of representatives each state has. The South is going to argue that slaves need to be counted when determining population for representation, as if they were citizens. The North says no way, slaves aren't represented in Congress, so they shouldn't be counted. Plus, their numbers could be easily increased, which would allow the South to manipulate their population and have more power than they should in the legislative branch. So immediately, the issue of slavery is dividing the nation, and this will be the first compromise to deal with this issue, not the last. All right, and what the delegates decide is that for every 5 slaves counted in the census, will count as 3 people. The 3/5ths Compromise. Messed up. Okay? So, looking at Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. So the Constitution is written. It goes back to the states for approval, ratification, and like anything else, some people love it, some people hate it. These 2 sides are the Federalists, who supported ratification of the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who opposed it. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay are a few of the leading Federalists, and these 3 guys write a series of articles called the Federalist Papers in an effort to convince people to support the Constitution. These papers and the Federalists overall argue for the need for a strong national government. Federalists were strongest in the North and were likely to be businessmen. The Federalists were well organized and had a plan, the Constitution. All right? The Anti-Federalists were opposed to throwing out the Articles and giving up state power. They feared a strong government. Anti-Federalists were strongest in the South and were more common men. And we'll talk more about that with Jackson. Unfortunately for them, they aren't well organized. They don't have a plan or alternative to the Constitution except the Articles, and everyone can see they're on the way out because of their ineffectiveness. They do, however, make a stand, and despite objection from the Federalists, get a Bill of Rights included Arguments against the Bill of Rights were along the lines from the Federalists that they were redundant and unnecessary, that listing our rights also could be used to limit them to just those listed. So remember, that's why Madison puts in the Ninth Amendment, okay? I think that's pretty good for a quick review of the Constitutional Convention.